Here. Okay, so my name is Dr. Erica Steele, and you are in a trauma webinar. We are going to be discussing all things trauma. We'll start off with my background, my experience, my training, my education, how I became an expert on trauma. I do call myself an expert in trauma, believe it or not. And we will then go into what trauma is, how trauma is classified. My little doggies will be in the back, doing their little doggy thing. So if you hear that little jingle, it's them doing whatever they do. We will also go over all the aspects of trauma and how trauma impacts individuals, humans. We're all humans on this particular webinar. And then we will go about what we can do about it. And of course, it's very informal. So if you have questions, feel free to either shout them out or you can put them in the chat box. I will pay attention to all of that. And then if you are unable to make, obviously you're here, so you're able to make it, but we will be sending out a copy of the webinar afterwards. Give me a couple of days though, because sometimes I edit it or whatnot, break it down, that kind of thing. And so we'll just be able to go through that. And then perfect. So I'm just going to mute everybody just so that we can keep the flow. And then of course we'll open it up. So if you wouldn't mind hitting the chat box, if you have any questions, and we'll kind of go through again. If you've never been to one of my webinars before, I pretty, informal in terms of like asking questions and things like that. I've been a teacher for a long time, so we're good to go on that. All right, groovy. So now we're going to get into our webinar. So if you're not familiar with me and my education, this is my education. So I have an AS in Psych. I have a BS in Alternative Medicine, a BS in Natural Healthcare Sciences, and that's bachelor's degree of science, a doctorate in natural medicine, a doctorate in naturopathy, a master's in public health with an emphasis in complementary alternative medicine. And I have, I can't even list all the certifications that I have, but I did focus on the ones specifically to mind-body medicine modalities. I have certifications in neurolinguistic programming, leadership, trauma-informed care, psychoneuroimmunology, which is the emotional manifestations of disease, which I'll be moving into my PhD in the fall on, and applied psychophysiology. And that's just how trauma affects the brain and all kinds of different components. We'll talk more about that as we go on and on. So I've been in natural health care for over 20 years. I have been, I've had my practice. I have a holistic family practice, and I do work with a lot of families, and many of whom have experienced trauma in their own worlds. So that is my professional background. So here's my street cred, if you want to call it. So I had complex trauma, and we'll get into what complex trauma is. So complex trauma is I've had multiple traumatic experiences. So my mother, she was a cancer researcher for NIH, and at the age of 8, she had a psychotic break. My mother and my father both suffered significant amounts of trauma growing up, and they both left their homes and joined the Marine Corps, and they both served in the United States Marine Corps, and they met and married and had a baby, and that baby was me. So my parents were both very, very amazing people, and I love them dearly and talk to them all the time, and we have healed in so many ways. However, they were products of their own environment, and then they didn't have the skills and the tools in order to ensure that I had a healthy, loving environment. My mother was diagnosed with, at the time they called it multiple personality disorder. Now they refer to it as DID, which is dissociative identity disorder. My mother had 18, she has 18 currently, 18 verified personalities. So, and that's because of the trauma that she experienced both in her childhood, as well as the trauma that she experienced in the United States Marine Corps. My mother Extremely traumatized, very brilliant woman, but it was very abusive growing up. So I experienced, also too, I'll say that growing up when I did, the United States Marine Corps did not value family. And so they would, send parents wherever. And my parents were stationed in Japan. And of course, my parents didn't take me they didn't take me with them. And they left me back here in the States. And so at that time, 4 years old, I was sexually abused for over a year by my nanny's husband and his son. And so experienced sexual abuse. Coming back, I didn't tell anybody, mostly because, my mom was pretty wild. My mom was from Southside Chicago. She didn't play around. She had a really quick, fuse. She'd go from like 0 to crazy in 2.5 seconds. I mean, I remember, growing up having cast iron skillets being thrown across the room while friends were over unannounced, so she wasn't really a woman to really play with. She was very fierce and fiery, and that's probably why my father loves her so much, because of that fiery energy. However, a lot of mental abuse, emotional abuse. My parents, did not know how to manage emotions naturally. The Marine Corps didn't teach them how to manage emotions in a healthy way. They've come a long way and have healed a lot in their own right. And then there was a lot of physical abuse. So my mother was, one of her personalities was actually homicidal. And so was very triggered easily. And so I didn't sleep probably for the first 20 to, I think I actually slept through the night. Like, oh my gosh, this is what people do when they go to sleep. I was around 31 when I first experienced that. So, because, you develop hypervigilance, which we'll talk about at a later time. But my ACE score is 10. So ACE scores are what we call adverse childhood experiences. You can Google it. You can take a score. They have there was an amazing pediatrician in California. She was in a high position for a while, and she actually studied childhood trauma and created what we call the ACE scoring, so adverse childhood experience scoring. And so it's actually a scale of 1 to 5, and you notice mine's a 10, but that's just because of the amount of trauma. And so she scored you like for instance, if you had a family member incarcerated, I did not, but I had a family member with mental illness and obviously sexual abuse and mental abuse, emotional, et cetera, et cetera. So, you get kind of scoring numbers for each one of these situations. And then they give you a score. And that score is significant because it does, as you kind of see in the pyramid here. So these adverse childhood experiences do disrupt your neurodevelopment. So again, like I told you, I had hypervigilance. I couldn't sleep. I had lots of anxiety, depression, listlessness, hopelessness, helplessness. My parents, because they were trained killers, they're very calculated in how they did things. They were very isolating in how they did things. It was always me and my fault, and I was always the problem, et cetera. And it was deeply painful. And so by 14 years old, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. I no longer carry that diagnosis. I've healed myself, but it's important for you to understand kind of where I'm coming from it. So for many, many, many years, I did not have a healthy relationship with myself. I didn't have a healthy relationship with my body. I didn't have a healthy relationship with, men. Obviously, I acted out my trauma quite a bit. I just, having, interpersonal relationships was very difficult. I didn't have healthy boundaries. We'll kind of go on and on and on. And I had lots of anxiety, like just debilitating anxiety, and was always afraid at any given moment. And, somebody would walk in the room. My daughter, I have an 18-year-old daughter, and her growing up, I couldn't handle noise. Like, it was just freak me out. And of course, like, there was no way I'd like horror movies and stuff like that. But one of my daughter's favorite things to do, fairly cruel now, but we laugh about it, is she would jump out and scare me. Right. And I mean, I would hit the ceiling. I mean, of course, it's definitely not the funniest. I can laugh about it now, but that just kind of goes to show how sensitive, I was as a result, and which is why it's made me into an incredible clairvoyant and empath, because when you have a mother with multiple personalities and you walk in the door, from school, you have no idea who you're walking into. Who was the person that you left may not be the person who you come home to. And at any given time, that person can change. And so it definitely made for a very interesting childhood. So, however, I ended up leaving my house at 16 years old because it kind of got to a point where it was I'm either going to kill this woman, or she's going to kill me, or I'm going to kill myself. I'd already attempted suicide, unfortunately, at that point, and was not successful. And so, having your stomach pumped is not a good situation. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And I'd already been through a rehab facility, and I had already been through, the mental health, route in terms of like the little fixed things. And they had already started putting me on massive amounts of drugs, different psychotropics in a developmental brain. And so I just, at a certain point, I said, you know what, I have a mission. I knew that I was going to be a doctor. I knew I was going to have a big impact in the world. So I decided at 16 years old to leave my house with nothing. I'd never been through driving education. I didn't have a photo ID. I didn't have an insurance card, no money, no job skills. I signed myself out, disenrolled myself out of an advanced studies diploma, and I left, pretty much overnight. And I didn't look back. And so over that course of time, I studied trauma. I studied, because I wanted to heal myself. I started off in psychology. And what I realized with my cohort was that people that tend to be attracted to that have experienced a lot of trauma in their own lives. But what I saw was people trying to heal themselves through other people. And I really did not want that transference. I didn't want to be healing myself through other people. I really wanted to do no harm. And so I took a step back from psychology and took a different route. I took more in the biochemistry, functional medicine space. And that's how I kind of got into laboratory medicine, because I grew up running around labs as a kid with my mom, and also with my stepmom, who was a geneticist. So, it helped kind of explain chemically what was going on, because I wanted to also understand why a totally healthy woman, from bird's eye view, just completely snapped overnight. And what I came to, there's a lot of ancestral trauma. On that side of my family, my mother has European roots, African roots, as well as Native American roots. And actually, when she was working through her trauma, that's when she decided we went back to our Native American roots. And I was raised in a Native American way in a process, which is why my practice is so spiritually driven and universally spiritually driven. And so I learned too that my grandmother was also schizophrenic. My great grandmother also experienced, manic depressive bipolar. And as I kind of went through, I study family constellation, which is a form of psychotherapy taken out of the Zulu tribe through way of Bert Hellinger. And it studies how trauma is pretty much passed down generationally. And that is definitely going to be the basis of my PhD in the fall. And so I start one last degree. I'll start my PhD in applied psychophysiology to really study trauma, transgenerational trauma, and how we pass that down through the DNA, because we kind of come in traumatized and then live it out from there. So that's a little bit about my background into how I kind of got fascinated in the world of trauma, coming from trauma and healing myself from trauma, and wanting to help other people. So, all right, so let's move on. So what is trauma exactly, right? So now we'll talk about kind of the types of trauma, but let's just talk about kind of simply a traumatic event, right? When you have a traumatic event, the mind and the body and the spirit go incongruent, right? And the more traumas you have, the more incongruent it becomes, right? So if you have one isolated traumatic experience, it's a little easier to heal than, let's say, multiple traumatic experiences. You become out of harmony with yourself because the mind is trying to make sense of what's actually happening physically, right, to you, and also too emotionally. There's a lot of confusion. So there's a lot of collections of thoughts and emotions, and you're disjointed. You don't know what's up and what's down and what's left and it's right. And that's why a lot of us act out of our traumas. Like sometimes you're kind of hovering above yourself, within the healing process. Sometimes that some of these behaviors are not healthy, right? I can't even tell you how many people I've dated where I go, this is not healthy. Like this relationship is not healthy, but I continue to go back on and on and on and on and on because of that disharmony. Luckily that's done now, praise God. I've learned enough, right? And so, but there is that disharmony of self, and there's an incongruence that goes on. And so your thoughts are one way, your emotions are another way, and you're just kind of all over the place. So the types of trauma, so we have an acute trauma, which is just a single incident, let's say like a robbery, right? Like, something happens, it's just shock, instantly, boom, boom, done, right? Chronic is where it's more repeated. So maybe like, a molestation, right? That's going to be repeated and prolonged. Now, not any other aspects of trauma, just that one, type of trauma, right? Complex trauma, like I was mentioning before. So, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, all of those different abuses, right? Start to create what we call complex trauma. Complex trauma is the more complicated to treat because you have to treat multiple perspectives. You can't just treat it like one and done thing. Not that acute is, one and done kind of approach, but it's a little bit easier for the mind and the body and the emotions to release that out. We'll use the word rationalize it in a little bit of an easier way. Chronic, there's a lot more guilt. There's a lot more, what did I do? I did this is wrong. There's some of that going on. Complex trauma, like you are all over the place. You are like up, down, left, right, like you don't even know your name half the time. And so complex trauma is you're reacting, you're triggered to a lot of people, places, situations, and circumstances, and events totally unrelated. You're very irrational. Your thoughts are one way, your emotions are another way, you're just kind of raging against the machine there. So complex trauma, unfortunately, is a little more common in these day and age because, our world that is occurring right now. So now we're going to kind of break this down into how trauma affects us in various ways. So let's start with physical, right? So your meridian system. So I don't have a photograph of the meridian system. I probably should have put that, but your meridian system is your bioenergetic system. It's the same system that acupuncture is based off of. So there's all these lines of chi or energy that run through your body. When you're physically, let's say, hit or sexually abused or things, or even mentally, emotionally abused, it's going to impact the meridian system. It's going to impact the bioenergetic frequency because everything in this universe that we're in is energy, right? You internalize stress and emotions, right? Not knowing how to process them, not knowing how to deal with them, being incongruent. That can do a few things. Eventually, it can create chronic disease because of poor diet and lifestyle choices, obviously risky behaviors and things like that. Like if you're acting out certain things or you're trying to numb everything out, and addiction and those kinds of components. Also, too, when you become, you can become a hypochondriac. And what I mean by that is, you have symptoms, that are unexplained, but then you start getting into the fear of, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. I need to fix it. I need to figure out what's wrong with me. It's all based in that traumatic experience that I'm at fault, I'm responsible, I did something, the guilt and the shame, I'm bad, I'm wrong, I need to be punished, those kinds of thought process. And then physically now you're like, you're not connected with your body. Which, there can be a lot of things that happen when you're not connected with your body. And it's very interesting because until you snap out of it, you don't even realize what's going on. And that's why I do classes like this, why I do seminars like this, why I treat people, to help them to be able to see what they can't see for themselves. It can affect the heart. So the heart is where the center energetic of like vulnerability and receiving, right? So we can shut that part down, and then, palpitations, nervousness, respiratory, your breathing. We also hold our grief in our lungs. And so that can, create incongruence in the bioenergetic system and then create respiratory challenges. Some people manage their stress by smoking, those sorts of things. So obviously that's going to impact the respiratory system. I see a lot of challenges with the digestive tract because that's the area of personal power, self-love, self-worth, and self-acceptance. And so let's say you're bracing yourself for impact. A lot of times people will have, chronic diarrhea, they'll have stomach aches, they won't eat, or they'll overeat. Also too, I notice that if people have a mother wound, they will, like eat at night, like they'll wake up. Like I remember there was times where I would wake up in the middle of the night and be so hungry, like, and want to go eat. And I'm like, check, and so, and it's based off of, the emotional trauma. Obviously poor diet, because if you don't feel good about yourself, you don't love yourself, you don't accept yourself, you're not necessarily going to feed yourself well. And then of course, depression, anxiety, you're up, you're down, you're left, you're right. Sometimes people will use, psychotropic agents to stabilize. I know as a child, my mother was very afraid that I was going to develop mental illness because it ran in my family. And so first grade, I was in therapy. I mean, by second grade, I was already on like Wellbutrin. I've been on Wellbutrin, Depakote, Zoloft, Paxil, Prozac, Xanax. I mean, you name it. I've been on it, which is also why, and was also why I'm very concerned when people do choose to put their children on those types of drugs, mainly because the brain is in development. And so it can impact developmentally the brain. And then when you put trauma on top of that, which also affects neurodevelopment, now you've got some, real kind of long lasting impacts of the brain. So how does trauma affect us emotionally? Well, afraid. I mean, I pretty much lived my life in fear for a long time. Nervous, right? Untrusting. If anybody would try to get close to me, I would feel very untrusting. Vulnerability scared me. I mean, I remember I did a seminar on sex and intimacy, right? This was like forever ago. And I did a seminar and they put us in these little small groups. And, so it's like group of 5 people or whatever. And so, we're talking about, I was good with the sex part. I could talk about that all day. But when it got to the intimacy part, my nervous system would go through total freakouts. And that was at the time that I said, okay, I hadn't really addressed my PTSD at that time. I was probably in my, how old was I? I was probably, I say my late 20s. Yeah, I was in my late 20s. And so the intimacy part just scared me to pieces. And at that time, it dawned on me, oh, that's right. I never really treated my PTSD because, I left the house at 16. I was in survival mode. I got married at 18. I had a daughter by 19. I was in school, I always was busy. Like I was always going, right? I'd become a doctor. I started my practice, I was building my business. So I never, and then the reason I had kind of gone in this seminar was because I was a series of seminars and, we were learning personal growth and self-development to help our business. So I wouldn't have chosen that seminar, right? It was just one of the seminars we took kind of in the process. And so we got to that one and I was like, de nada, I'm out, And so I realized, wait a second, and I need to deal with this. And I was so anxious, like through the roof. And eventually I found neurofeedback and biofeedback, which is what we'll talk about later on. Okay, so confusion, right? Total incongruence. I don't even know what's going on. Depression, anger. I used to be very emotionally shut down. And that was for some time. And it was just because, my parents were just not functioning emotionally. And like if I would cry or something, my mother would say, just stop crying, you're being weak, kind of thing. So I got a lot of those, really limiting beliefs about, what it means to have emotions. And I was very sensitive, like incredibly sensitive. Well, and I was created to be sensitive, right? And so when you continue to suppress, right, you pretty much have two emotions, neutral or pissed off, right? And so, I could be set off at a moment's notice, like you say, so, you tell me, good morning, and I could bite your head off at any time. And so became very rageful. Definitely not some of my most proudest moments. I've, screamed like bloody murder in the middle of, Bank of America when they made a mistake on my bank account once, definitely not prideful moments, but I can see now, a lot of it was just an impact of trauma, right? Bitterness is also an impact of trauma because it stems from that lack of forgiveness of self as well as others. And especially when your parental figures are the ones that, they're supposed to like love and cherish you and all the things, right? And if they're the abusers, your mind has a really hard time wrapping the brain around it. And, a little bit easier with other people, I think, but when it's coming directly from your parents, sometimes that can really create a lot of things to have to work through. Judgmental, because you're always assessing for safety. You're always having to kind of size people up pretty quick. And then also controlling, right? So when people fear a loss of control or powerlessness, like sexual trauma has a lot of powerlessness to it. And so what people do is they'll try to grab onto any semblance of control that they have, right? So you'll see those people very domineering, very controlling, for lack of a better word. And then, just very dominating. And you'll kind of see that. So how does trauma affect us mentally, right? So we talked about that confusion, right? So we talked about the mind just can't figure it out. The mind's like, what in the world? What is going on, right? It just can't understand what's happening. Like, and sometimes when we have that constant, like, I don't understand, and we're trying to understand, that sometimes is an effective trauma because the subconscious mind, which houses all those experiences and perceptions of those experiences, isn't congruent with the information that the conscious mind, which your conscious mind is your logic, your voice, your reason, your decision making, those two aspects are not matching up. So, let's say let's say I meet somebody who's absolutely amazing and treats me wonderful, right? If I hadn't healed myself, right, my conscious mind is saying one thing, but my subconscious mind is like, what? Are you kidding me? You can't trust people, especially not men. I'll give you an example. I'm married, so I've been married 3 times, and my second husband was much older than myself, and at that time I hadn't realized the trauma that I experienced sexually as a child. And so when I came out of that, I realized, oh my gosh, I've married this really old person, right? He was like 30 years older than me. He could have been my father, for crying out loud. And it just dawned on me, oh my gosh, look at what I did. I recreated this trauma and not even knowing it. So you're not aware of what it is you're doing, because the subconscious mind is giving the conscious mind marching orders, and it's telling it, okay, these are the decisions you want to make this, make that, make this, right? It also tries to make sense of all the traumatic events. And again, like we were saying, hypervigilance, right? So if you try to go to bed at night, and this is what would happen, is my mind would not shut off. Like it would keep going and going and going and going and going. And that's that hypervigilance in the brain. And what it is your mind is like a prey animal, right? It's going, wait a second, we're in the middle of the woods. There's predatory animals around. If you go to sleep, you could be eaten. And so it creates this hypervigilance in the brain. So with that, during the day, right? So you don't get very good sleep. I mean, I just think back like, how on earth, right? And then during the day, total lack of focus. So when you're, and these are kind of like the ADD, ADHD brains. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but there is a hypervigilant component to it because it's a neurodevelopment issue. Because 1 minute it's like ping, 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 ping. I had to retrain my brain to be able to sit and focus, because when you're building a business, right, and people are depending on you, and you're not able to focus or use your prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, which is your short-term decision making, and you're not able to really concentrate on one thing at a time because your brain is going in 1,000 different directions, it makes it really hard to build systems and processes in order to scale a business, right? And so I really started to go, wait a second, like, and I would have to sit, and it would be so uncomfortable to just sit and focus on one thing. I still have not as nearly as bad. I mean, I can do it if I want to, but it really requires a lot. I have to be like either on my phone, like doing a PowerPoint. Like, I love doing this for you guys because it illustrates things. But if I was on the receiving end of this, I would have to be on my phone. I could listen and I could get all the information, but I'd have to be doing something else to kind of keep my brain, happy. Ruminating, that's when, let's say something happens outside of your control and you're thinking oh my gosh, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or why did I say this? Or, you're constantly replaying it over and over and over in your head. Some people check out completely. They just disassociate. They leave their body. I used to do this a lot, especially in sexual experiences. I would just go off into Never Never Land. And that was a coping mechanism, and that was a trauma response, right? And then some people, they just shut down mentally. They're just like, nope, nothing to see here. I'm fine. Everything's fine. World's fine, even though everything's burning down to the ground, not literally, just figuratively, right? So those are some of the ways mentally that trauma affects us. Hold on, let me make sure that I'm on. Okay. All right. So now your environment, right? So we talked about this a little bit, but now we're going to kind of drive it home. So your relationships, right? The people you choose to have in your life, right? I had so many unhealthy relationships in my life. I had unhealthy staff people, I mean, I think I hired my mother like multiple times, right? Like, I know I hired my father. I dated my mother. I've dated my father multiple times, and so because you've normalized certain behaviors, you've normalized certain traumas, you've normalized this. Like I'm very, I recently wanted to volunteer for a business organization to mentor specifically, minority women, because there was not a lot of mentorship, and I'm a first generation entrepreneur. So I just signed up to mentor, and then you have to go through like this training process, et cetera. So I went through the initial training and then said, okay, what are my next steps, whatever. And this retired lieutenant commander or whatever, I guess, was heading it up. And whoever I am, I triggered her to pieces. So just trying to get a date and a time scheduled for the next step, she's calling me, controlling and a narcissist, and she's calling me, abrasive and all these things, right? And I actually was pretty neutral about it, because I'm like, okay, I know that's your stuff, right? Like, I didn't take it personally. And I said, okay, well, I get that, and I can trigger people and et cetera, but can we schedule a date, right? And so we ended up, she ended up getting through that emotionally, and then we scheduled the date. And then, we went through the training, and then again, I had to kind of ask for something else. And then she kind of went through it again. And I was talking to one of my mentors, and she's like, Erica, like, maybe you don't need to do that, And so I realized, I was like, you know what? I am so desensitized to, crazy. And obviously, I mean, not that my patients are crazy. I love them all, but, I'm very comfortable
with people and their moods up and down, because when you have a mother that can go from 0 to 60, it's very normal. So you tend to normalize things that are not necessarily normal. And so I've had to like study what healthy people look like and do. There's some great YouTubes I've seen too that like they'll model like what is unhealthy, and then they'll model what's healthy, and those have been wildly helpful, because otherwise you have no context. You also have no boundaries, right? And so, because especially if there's physical or sexual trauma, there's you don't really understand that you can say no, right? Or if you say no and there's a punishment, then it really makes a lot of confusion with boundaries, right? And so, and sometimes there's a lot of role reversal. So like with my mother, there's been a lot of role reversal where I was the mom and she was the child, which so I have to, even to this day, I have to continue to reinforce boundaries and reinforce, love her to pieces, still talk to her all the time, and believe you me, there was times where I could not have conversations. I had to take space from both my parents, my mother and my father. My father is a little bit different. He doesn't deal. Like, he's just like, okay, but he's come a long way as well. So you just tend to not have boundaries and not be able to fully express and communicate yourself. I've had probably every unhealthy relationship you could possibly imagine. And we talked about all the crazy people I've hired. My staff is great now. I've healed all those wounds. So, I haven't, some of the patients have been with me for a long time. Remember those days we laugh about them sometimes. And so the other thing too is risky behavior, because you don't really, you don't really have a good sense of self or self-love or self-respect, so, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. As a hippie, I toured the country, you can put the dots together. It was a pretty wild ride. And then obviously addictions too. And then here's the thing, when those chemicals in your brain are already kind of hardwired for a certain, component, right? Like if you're constantly being overstimulated, your brain's going to love dopamine. It's going to constantly look for that little, hit of something, if you will. Also too, if you go more on the depressive side, you're going to definitely need more serotonin to be able to bring yourself up. So the brain, you can mimic any of those things naturally in the brain, by the way, but we definitely have to be mindful, and when somebody is not in a healing process with their trauma, that they can be acting out in addiction. So spiritually, what happens to you when you've experienced trauma? So there's anger towards the creator, or God, or whatever you want to call it. There's also disbelief. People like, there is no God, just we're going to be atheists. And how could God, do this? And, all those things, we blame God for that. There could be denial, like there's just nothing. And, it's like, whatever, I'm just here, and then that lack of faith. And then the lack of faith sometimes will translate into, it's just me. It's just going to be on me, and I'm the one who's going to do it. I've studied this in my practice before. I don't tend to do well, meaning like be able to reach people that have kind of shut that down, because when we try to build hope or build some sort of like greater than, it falls flat. Because if I believe that I'm the only answer and I'm the only truth, but I'm mired in my own insanity, and I say insanity with love, it's very difficult to be able to move through that. So you see that with narcissistic tendencies, where they have severe fears of abandonment, but so now they've just walled themselves in and isolated them out, which is why they kind of create that personality defect of narcissism. In my case, and this has been amazing, is because I was so involved in my Native American heritage and tradition. I did prayer ties and vision quests and dances, and we did a lot of chanting and drumming, and my godmom is a Native chief. The creator was all we had. God was all we had. So and even like Wayne Dyer, for instance, I don't know if you know his story, but I'll summarize it really quick. So Wayne Dyer, was his parents had like, I think 9 children or something, some, large amount. And this was back when social services wasn't a thing, right? And so his father just left one day and left his mother, and his mother couldn't afford, all the kids. So she had to adopt out the kids. And one of the people that he adopted, one of the children he adopted was Wayne Dyer. And Wayne Dyer, and he had a great relationship with his mom, but he would, he said, one of the reasons why God did that was to bring him closer to God, right? And there was no inputs of parents. And I really feel that true, especially in my story, because every step of the way in my life, even to this day, like, my intuition, my discernment, my relationship with God is so deep. And this is a spiritual relationship. It's not a religious one. I've definitely been religious and dogmatic, as Jewish for a long time. I mean, like super in there, like waking up every morning on a Hanukkah, like, the whole thing. I'll spare the details, but at the center focus has always been spirituality and truth for me, which has guided me to bring this message and to really help people who have struggled like I have, because unfortunately it was just me and God. There was no, I mean, I don't say unfortunately, but there was no webinar on what to do. There was like, me and all my traumas. So I'm grateful to be able to use this to help people. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So the last section we'll look at is ancestrally. And that's when we carry old patterns and beliefs from previous generations. Those are passed down. And then also being mindful of not carrying forward those future generations. So I have a daughter. And so she, like I said, she's 18 now. And it was tough in the beginning. Like, like I was like, I have no skills to be able, I would come, I mean, it's so funny. Like, she, with her preteens, like I walk in the house and, she'd have like the music blaring and, I just couldn't handle it. And so I'd walk in and be like, oh my, and my house would look like an explosion of like makeup and clothes, and that this is like my living room, and I'm like, oh my God, and one of the things too that happens when you've been through trauma like I have is that you're very sensitive to environment. Like you're very sensitive to things that are placed around. Like all my home, my office is all feng shuied because the energy needs to be in a certain place for me to feel like I can't deal with a lot of clutter or any of that kind of stuff. It like freaks me out. So anyway, so I go in and it's like this explosion, and just raising my voice, man, she would act like she'd been like beaten for days. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like how could this be, like very sensitive. And so I had to learn, how to like communicate and be like, okay, Gabrielle, hi, how are you doing? What's going on? Why does my living room, look like, like, I mean, it was very, like, I had to really train myself. There was very much a learning curve so that I didn't pass down, because I didn't want to, right, pass down, unhealthy patterns to her. And I wanted her to be as healthy as possible. Also too, ancestrally, not being conscious or present to one's personal responsibility. So it's like, I'm a victim, right? I'm a victim to circumstance, this happened to me. So of course, so cue the drama. And then also to the transgenerational trauma that's really been recorded in our DNA. So, going over my background, African, I've traced all that back and had to do healing work on slavery, very painful, and how, African American and African American culture tends to deal with the impact of trauma through mental illness, also through addiction, violence. Also too, a lot of times, the men have kind of left, and the women are left to kind of tend to everything. So the hyper independent woman, I come from a long line of very independent women. And then in the Native American line, right, the genocide I've had to go through and heal from the genocide of that. Very painful. Oh my God. Like, yeah, very, very challenging, but very relieving. And that's part of that over responsibility and lack of boundaries that I had to really work on early on. And then the Irish, there was a lot of, my dad's side is Irish. So Irish, Scottish, and English. And so the Irish, there's a lot of poverty and child labor, and I had to go through and heal that. There's also Native on my father's side as well. And then the Scottish, there's a lot of like Viking kind of thing going on there. And so having to kind of work through some of that. And then the English line, which a little bit more sinister and, definitely a lot of, ancestral sexual trauma coming out of England as I've studied and also, seen with working with other people. So and so this is really kind of how I came to understand holistic medicine. And this is why I've become a holistic doctor, because when you're healing a human, so it started off like, okay, so I left psychology and then I go, okay, well, let me just, work with people. Let me get really good at biochemistry, laboratory diagnostics. I'm going to run a lab and treat the lab, right? And then it was like, okay, run the lab, treat the lab, and then give people diets, right? And then that didn't work. And then it was like, okay, so run the lab, give people the treatment, heal the diet, but then now like all the mental and emotional stuff is coming up, right? And so then it leads to environment and time management and all the things. So it just started to grow. So this is something of my design. It's not something that I learned. It's something that I intuited. And so these are all the different components, right? And so when I looked at that framework for you and I created it, it was really out of kind of what I've seen in healing myself and also to helping other people heal. So these are the different kind of components in more of a visual aid. All right, so now we went over all that. So what do we do about it? Like, what in the world? We don't just want to, talk about the problems or the issues of this. We actually want to be able to do something proactively about it, right? And I want to make sure that you leave with some, practical tools. So let's start off with what doesn't work. Okay, so because I think that's really important to know what doesn't work first, because I've done it all, trust me. So doing nothing doesn't do anything. It's actually worse if you do nothing and you're shut down and you just pretend that it's everybody else and not you. And you'll see it in failed relationships, you'll see it in work, you'll see it in finances, you'll see it with your kids, it'll start to become blaringly obvious that you are the common denominator in all of your challenges. Traditional talk therapy does not work for trauma, and here's why. And I've been involved in a lot of study on this, again, personally, as well as professionally. So traditional talk therapy actually re-traumatizes you. So I was part of a study in William and Mary, and the students, were studying trauma and how trauma impacts the mind and whatever. And, they sat me in this room with the therapist, and they had a camera and they walk me through, like, I have to talk about, all the traumatic events. Right. And I would leave so angry and so, like, my nervous system was fried. Like, I would get into fights with people, my partner at the time, like, oh my God, I don't know how many cell phones, died in the process of that, just being flung across the room. Like, so traditional talk therapy is very traumatizing because you're talking about, and then you're reliving the trauma. So I don't recommend that. There's a lot of coaches going around these days. There's a lot of coach. I'm a coach. I'm a this coach. I'm a that coach. And so it's very important to check their training, right? And so a weekend workshop is not going to cut it, right? Because, what happens so here's the other thing. If the person, and this goes into their point, like, if a person has not experienced trauma for themselves and healed their trauma, right, and then don't have training on top of that, very challenging. It's not going to give you a container to be able to feel safe, right? So in my practice, we created so much structures to help support, right? So like just our tasking system alone to make sure that we're dependable and we don't miss anything, right? Making sure that we're on time as best as possible, making sure that we communicate with the patients. We actually train our staff in all of the trauma-informed care to make sure that patients don't just show up and they don't have an appointment and that triggers their abandonment and their loss and all that kind of stuff. We really, and this is also why I'm very transparent with who I am, because when you've been through trauma, like you're literally like scoping it out, waiting for somebody to either offend you or somebody to like slip up. And so that you can't trust because you don't trust yourself. And so working with some untrained coaches really, and trust me, I've worked with them over the years, and I've learned, unfortunately through being destabilized, many times, meaning that like I'll be working with, I'll give you an example. I hired a very successful relationship coach because I was like, okay, I'm like enough with these relationships, right? And so I hired a very successful relationship coach who looked like she had some success and she was engaged and all the things. And so I was like, okay, so I met with her and we start kind of unpacking stuff. And, she has me go through like, what was it? Inner child work, right? So inner child work in terms of, what, I have to list out all my partners and which one of my unhealed inner children, chose that partner and all the things, right? So this is very like, deep work, and I'm taking my time doing it. And like, I'm writing things out and, and I'm spending time. Right. And then, I travel every 3 months. So then I like took a pause and I'm just kind of grieving. And, I ended up leaving a relationship that I was in and that was toxic for me. So I had to like grieve and like release and let things go. And she's like, come on. She's like, let's go. Let's start manifesting your new partner. And I'm like, whoa. Like, wait a second, like I just need to like heal, right? And she's like, no, and so I realized, oh, wait a second, like she's got no mental health training, no, and I'm somewhat, naive and trusting. I'm not as in terms of like coaching now. I'm a little like, it did help me in terms of like, moving forward, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to be coached anymore, right? Like I'll do whatever, I didn't manifest a partner, but I just like ended the relationship and was like, okay, I'm good, like we're good there. And so you really want to vet the people that you're going to be working with, because they can, like I said, destabilize you. I luckily, at that point, I had, a lot of chops, and so I'm able to kind of pull myself back in. But somebody who's not, who's still very fragile and doesn't have, as many tools and skills, it can, like I said, destabilize you mentally and emotionally, and you don't want to have that. Also, one single treatment doesn't cut it, right? When I'm working with people with trauma, because it shatters the mind, it shatters the spirit so much, and all the different facets we were talking about, I have to take it from multiple approaches. I can't just take it from one specific approach, at all. And so also too, I don't necessarily, I used to go to, like I'd go on dates or whatever, and I would tell like the date or whatever, like I would vomit all over them, all my past, right? Or I would call friends and like, or family or whatever, and family would kind of re-traumatize me. So, those are not your people. I'm going to pause and kind of answer this question really quick. I'm going to read it out loud if that's okay. All right. So this person said, I almost always feel like things I've gone through are not traumatic in comparison to other people and things they've been through. I know there are different levels of trauma, but I feel like I'm not as high priority as people who've been through the worst. How do I acknowledge that I've been through things and should receive help as others have? Okay, so first thing, it's not a competition, right? And not everybody is a Lifetime television movie. I mean, let me tell you, my life is definitely a Lifetime television movie. So I am not the norm, right? Most people have not experienced that level of trauma, right? Number one. But number two is if you're on the planet, you're traumatized. Okay. Like we are, I mean, especially if you've been around the last 2 years, like it's like you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down. Right. And so I think, not feeling as though you're a priority is already a mental and emotional impact of trauma, right? It's not saying I am worth it, I am enough, I am available for, right? I am, what I've been through, has been hurtful, has been painful, right? I know deep down that I can transform it and I know that I can heal it, right? However, it's impacted me, right? So this is a part of that kind of acknowledgement, like you're acknowledging that, yes, I've been through things that have hurt me mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, however, right? Like there are things that have impacted me. So it's really about coming out of denial and being able to be fully honest with yourself. And so I think what you're referencing is really that emotionally you're disconnected from what has occurred. And that's that incongruence that I'm talking about with the mind, right? The mind is trying to rationalize it. So the mind is trying to say, you know what you went through is not that bad, right? And the emotions are like, but why does it feel this way? And the mind's like, well, I don't know, like this person went through this. So the mind, a lot of you guys still think that the mind is actually you and it's not you, right? And so we want to bypass the mind and stop listening to the crazy stories that the mind is telling us. And we really want to honor that deep, loving part of ourselves. We want to go to that age that we were, however that was when we were traumatized, right? And it doesn't have to, like I said, it doesn't have to be Lifetime television movie. It can be, I was on the playground and Billy came by and pulled my hair, and then I made up this story that, I'm not good enough and I'm not worthy enough or whatever, right? Like it doesn't have, like, there's no like measuring stick other than the ACE scoring, that says like this trauma is worse or not. And some people, they come in not with, as big of a calling, right? Like I believe that the bigger the trauma, the bigger the calling. And they also don't come in with as much dharmas and karmas that they need to work out in this life. And so, and that's okay, right? Like, not everybody's a Michael Jordan, right? And also too, it doesn't mean that, the person that cleans the floors every night of the Chicago Bulls, stadium or whatever is any less of a human than Michael Jordan. So, I kind of worked out that little basketball analogy there, but I'm proud of myself. So, but I just want you to recognize it's not about how you compare against others. It's how you are able to resolve it within yourself. So hopefully, that helps. I think that's a big word, acknowledgement, right? So it is about acknowledging the things that you've been through. I would take a pen and a paper and I would write down what you've been through. I've been through XYZ. I've been through A, B, and C. I've been through LMNOP, right? And then I would write, what did I think about those experiences? And what did I feel about those experiences? And what did I make those experiences mean about myself? Right. And so in the emails I send you, I'm going to send you guys some journal prompts to kind of work through as well. And so that way, you can kind of flush some of that out and make some new concepts and some new ideas. So hopefully that helped. If you have any additional questions about that, feel free. I've got another question. How do you compartmentalize things so you can confront one issue at a time? I find that when I begin to face any one of my traumas, everything breaks through the floodgates and it's too overwhelming and I retreat. Okay. So that's what we're talking about, the shattered part, right? It's like mental, emotional, physical. Okay. So this is about, so it's not about compartmentalization. Compartmentalization actually is a coping mechanism. That's a strategy that you have used in order to survive life, right? So when you begin to face one of the traumas, right? Your emotions start to come through and you're not comfortable with feeling your emotions, right? And so that's where learning how to self-soothe, right, comes in handy. So self-soothing techniques look like, and I have a course called 30 Days to Emotional Healing, which gives you 30 tools about how to soothe yourself emotionally. If you're interested in that, feel free to let me know and I'll send an email out about it anyway. And so one of the techniques I use is I just put my hand on my heart, right? And I just say to myself, you're okay. You're okay. I'm safe. I'm safe, right? Other things that I do are, I breathe into my body. I get present in my body, right? I remember my brain used to go in 50 billion directions all the time. And so I would have to go, what am I doing right now? Right. And I would say, okay, I'm sitting here. I've got the computer on my lap. I'm talking. I'm reading the screen, I'm numbering things. I mean, and my mind would go in 50 billion directions, right? So it's learning how to cope with the emotions and your emotional body, which has been impacted, but it's also giving your mind something to do at the same time, right? Overwhelm is that's a coping mechanism. It's a strategy that we use in order to survive. And so when you get overwhelmed, you're telling yourself that this, meaning this emotion, is bigger than me. And that's not true. Your emotions are not bigger than you. Your emotions are a part of you. They're self-created, and emotions are not real, right? You can also use EFT, emotional freedom technique. That's a tapping, and it works along the meridian system. You can YouTube different tapping techniques on overwhelm, and you do a setup statement, right? While you're tapping, even though I feel overwhelmed, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. Even though I feel really vulnerable right now, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. Even though, and you kind of keep going through those until you soothe and soften yourself. I also used it to help me because I was very emotionally shut down. And I was dating a guy who was equally emotionally shut down. And I said, well, it must be me because, and then, I started coming out of it. So, through tapping, and it was like amazing because I started feeling emotions. And so I would say until you get comfortable with your emotions, just go easy, right? Maybe compartmentalize it during the day and then schedule yourself. Like I remember in my practice, early on, because I was still kind of healing through the whole process, and I would experience an emotion and I would write it down, right? And I would unfortunately, even though this isn't healthy, I would compartmentalize it. I'd say, okay, I'm going to take anger and I'm going to stick you here, but I'm going to talk to you later on, right? And then once I was done with all the patients, I would say, okay, anger, come on. And then, I would bring it up and I would be with that anger and I would learn how to be with my emotions. I would acknowledge my emotions. I would visualize my emotions as like a color or shape, or something that I could hold, and I would thank that emotion. I would honor that emotion. I'd say, thank you for being with me. Thank you for, keeping me safe. Thank you for holding on to me, right? And I wouldn't try to push it away. I would instead try to accept it as a part of myself. And as you do that, as you begin to accept it, it will neutralize that emotion, and it'll lose its intensity. So hopefully that helps. Okay, another question. Can a person have trauma but not remember what happened? Absolutely. So we talked about like disassociation, and the mind just kind of checks out. So again, I was molested at 4, and I didn't realize that I had been molested until 24. Now, mind you, like with this babysitter, it was over a year. I would throw up every time, I would eat, there was no explanation of it. I was very stoic. Once my mom picked me up, I was really like, just my whole vibe kind of changed. But I just shut it down. And the reason I shut it down is because, again, my mom was a trained killer. So if I told my mom what had happened, yeah, that man would not be living and my mom would have been, in jail. And so we do shut down, emotions and trauma, specifically trauma, at certain points, really just to cope with things. And so sometimes there's validity in bringing those things up. Sometimes it's better for the mind to keep it compartmentalized, right? And it's because it can destabilize the mind. So this, if you believe that you have a trauma that is buried or something like that, it's really just those layers coming through and working with somebody to kind of help peel back those layers. But when it's ready, trusting when it's ready to come out, it will come out. But also too, remember that what happens with trauma is you learn not to trust yourself. And so if you feel and you believe and you experience, whether it's true or not, it's about honoring yourself and how you feel, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to react based off of it, but just being with it and telling yourself, you know what? It's okay for me to feel this way. It's safe for me to feel this way. I may not even, maybe the affirmation is, I may not even understand why I feel this way, but I do feel this way. And so I'm going to honor myself for that. And so that's definitely one way. I'm not a big fan of like going and fishing for things. I rather allow them to kind of organically come out. And the reason for that is because the mind compartmentalizes things for a reason. And so when I say compartmentalization, it's different from what I was talking about with that other person. This is if you can't access it. If you can access the emotions and you can access these memories and things like that, then it's ready to come up. It's ready to come out and it's ready to heal. There was a lot of exercises I did about, like putting trauma on a bookshelf. It was when I first discovered clinical hypnotherapy. Like that was like game changer. Like it was really, because I'd come out of the traditional talk therapy world and found a PsyD, and they finally started introducing me to some of these other modalities. And it was like, oh, thank God. It really helped me to process what was going on. So the mind, just trust the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul will release things as they need to release things. You don't need to go on any fishing expeditions. Although clinical hypnotherapy is one of those to kind of recreate some of those things. But again, you have to be with somebody who knows what they're doing, because otherwise you can destabilize yourself and it will not be pretty. So just be mindful of that. All right. How do we heal trauma that we can't remember? My mom is even sure that either something's happened and or something was passed down because of how much I don't remember. I don't remember much between 1 and 10, and that scares me. Okay, so let's break this down, right? So let's look at fear, right? So there's an excellent exercise that I've worked through and I give patients at times. It's the Deepest Fears Inventory. It's by Dr. Carolyn Elliott, and she is actually an English PhD, believe it or not, but she wrote a book called Existential Kink. And one of her assignments in there is, the book is kind of a far out kind of consciousness. I won't get too much into it, but this particular exercise is applicable, where we recognize that the mind on some level does enjoy the trauma, right? And so having is evidence of wanting. And I know it's like, enjoy the trauma. How could you? The mind starts to recognize that this is, like we were talking about, desensitized, right? So the mind goes, this is normal. This is, what we like. And this part of ourselves is able to hold on to this component, whatever this is, right? And so fear gives you a lot of chemicals, right? And your body physically can get addicted to a lot of these chemicals, the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, the adrenaline, the cortisol. And then your body goes, oh my God, we love all these crazy chemicals, right? And so we've got to start to deal with the fear, right? And so we neutralize the fear, right? Because your brain, when your amygdala hijacks your brain, your prefrontal cortex, which has all your decision-making factors in it, is not going to be able to think clearly. So you're not going to be able to bring up any kind of memory if you're clouded in fear, because the nervousness, anxiety, all that kind of stuff is not going to help. So we want to deal with the fear first, right? So the deepest fears inventory, you write down, on a piece of paper, God, angels, universe, whatever you want to call it. I deeply hate and resent whatever it is you want. So I deeply hate and resent my health. I deeply hate and resent my family. I deeply hate and resent my, love of my life, whatever. It doesn't matter. And the reason that you write it in the negative is because that's how the mind perceives it. So I deeply hate and resent the fact that I've, healed from this trauma, right? And there's nothing wrong with me, right? Because there is some of that like consciousness of there's something wrong with me and I need to figure it out. And so, I deeply hate and resent that I'm fully healed, right? Because I have deep fears that right? And you write down, because I have deep fears that and when I say you write down what the fears are, because I have deep fears that I'm not good enough, because I have deep fears that I'm traumatized, because I have deep fears that I've been sexually abused, because I have deep fears that I've been physically abused, because I have deep fears that, somebody's hurt me, whatever, right? And you get your gas tank empty, right? Where you just vomit on the page all of your fears, right? All of your irrational, illogical, oh my gosh, I can't believe I don't know what's going on. All those fears, you get it out on a piece of paper. And then you write at the bottom, you go, thank you, God, angels, universe, for removing these fears. I deeply forgive myself, right? And others. Thank you so much for your service. It is done. It is healed. It is accomplished now. And then you rip it up and throw it away, right? I did this. The other piece of it too is if you feel comfortable, you go to a safe person and you read out all your fears to them. And then they just say to you, thank you for sharing. And you go, thank you for listening. And then it's done. You rip it up, whatever. So I used to do that exercise every day, sometimes several times a day, because I was in so much fear. The book is called Existential Kink by Dr. Carolyn Elliott, and I will write it in the Existential Kink. I probably misspelled Existential Kink. Dr. Carolyn Elliott. I just put Dr. Elliott in there, and I butchered existential, but Google knows all. So I would literally, every time I would feel afraid, you're very welcome. I would journal that, right? And I would rip it up. And because I didn't call people during the day, I would just journal that down, rip it up and throw it away. And I'm going to tell you, it is amazing to help with any fear, right? Because you've got to neutralize the fear, get the chemicals in the body down, get the body out of that fight or flight mode to be able to be present with your body. You're only going to be able to heal if you're in that calm, peaceful, relaxed, meditative state. So just FYI on that. All right. So what does work? So we talked about what doesn't work. So now let's talk about what does work, right? So being honest with yourself, right? As honest as you are able to. Journaling. And I'm talking like old school pen and paper journaling, right? Writing actually accesses the subconscious mind, right? And so I encourage my patients to write all the time. Meditation, and mind you, meditation is not sitting and not thinking about anything, right? Meditation is not a skill. Some days I'll meditate and I'm like Guruji, I'm levitating. Other days I'm like thinking about my grocery list. And all aspects in between. So meditation is really just being present with yourself. I can meditate with my eyes open. I can meditate doing things at the same time. I can meditate while I'm talking to you guys, right? So meditation is just a state that you create. It's a state of calm, peace, and it may be challenging at first, but like anything, riding a bike, doing any kind of skill, you do it a little bit every day. And that helps. Yoga. So I've been trained in multiple types of styles of yoga, and I find that Kundalini yoga, which I probably should preface this, I will change this on the PowerPoint. Kundalini yoga, it deals with the Kundalini energy, not associated with sexual arousal. I know it gets a bad rap for that. However, when I went through a year-long Kundalini training. It's a lot of breath work. It's very rajastic. And so you're doing a lot of breathing. Excellent for anger, excellent for trauma, excellent for self-forgiveness. There's some really just powerful modalities. You can YouTube Kundalini yoga for childhood anger, Kundalini yoga for inner anger, and just amazing some of the results that I've gotten with that. During my yoga training, I didn't even realize how much I had things trapped in my body. I got the flu for the first time. I had vertigo for a week. I mean, that was like, and it was coming from a meditation I was doing that was shifting my nervous system, because my nervous system wasn't toned from all the trauma. And so also vagus nerve exercises really help too. It resets. It's very gentle. You can YouTube vagal nerve exercises. It helps reset the parasympathetic nervous system. Very helpful. And that's a somatic therapy. We use biofeedback in our practice. In my PhD that I'm starting in applied psychophysiology, we'll be getting more into neurofeedback. I've done neurostem. I've done EMDR as well, and that's a modality that's widely used in trauma, but I found it wasn't impactful enough for me. I think I was too far gone. So by the time I got to it, but neurofeedback, neurostem, amazing. Clinical hypnotherapy was also just amazing. And then of course, holistic medicine, because we deal with all aspects, body, mind, spirit, and everything else in between. All right. So what can you do now? Right now, right? So I really encourage you all to begin a small practice, like 5 minutes a day of meditation, if you haven't done already. And it's just really being with yourself, just learning to be present with yourself, learning to take breaths, learning to take time out, learning to communicate first with yourself, and then also learning to communicate with others. I put a couple books on here that have been very impactful. I mean, I'm a huge reader. I've read so many. So, but two, I think that are really powerful, that give a lot of exercises and tools. The Power of the Subconscious Mind by Dr. Joseph Murphy. Love that. You can get it on YouTube for free. The Universe Has Your Back by Gabrielle Bernstein. She's a little bit more like quirky, a little bit lighter. Dr. Murphy, it's like, I don't know, he's like a loving grandfather. Like I love his voice. It's very soothing. Another book that I absolutely love that I'll just throw on is Conversations with God. I can't remember who that is by, but I love like that. Just soothes my soul. Right. Also seek help. Like if you need some skills and some tools and some support, I'm definitely here. There's tons of amazing people out there in the world. Remember, check their background, very important to make sure that they are safe, and trust yourself, like trust your intuition. Affirmations such as you're safe, I would use that one so much, because when your mind is triggered, so you get triggered mentally, right? And then all those chemicals, it takes actually only 45 seconds for those chemicals to float through your body. But boy, it feels like a long 45 seconds. I used to have to affirm to myself when that was happening. I'd have to stop and go, you're safe, you're safe, you're safe, right? And that was just to help calm my nervous system down. It took a while just to get my body and my mind to like be on the same page with things. So affirmations can be very helpful. All right. And how we can help. So our practice is trauma informed. All of our staff members are all trained in trauma. It's a requirement of our job, of everybody's job. We have a holistic model. So even if we need stabilizers, I can mimic through mechanism of action pretty much most pharmaceutical interventions, and I can do it without side effects.
And so we address all aspects of self, mental, emotional, environmental, all the things that I went over, ancestral, etc. We use various modalities in our practice. Biofeedback, we just got a biofrequency device as well, which I'll be playing around with. I've been moving into frequency medicine for a long time, energy medicine. So we use vibroacoustics, we use brain training, we use biofrequency. We also have a human biofield camera, which is more sensitive than PET scan, CT, MRI, and that actually reads where a person is stuck energetically in the body. And then I have a lot of practical experience, so I will share as it applies, what has worked for me, what hasn't worked for me, and different concepts I'm trying to teach you. I teach through the work that I've done, and that was why I wanted to heal myself before, I unleashed myself to the public, and so I do have healthy boundaries for sure. So, you don't need to caretake me at all. And also too, we have a respectful relationship. So, I don't mind if people yell, scream, etc. Just don't yell at me or call me names. I have actually had to escort people out of my practice for those kinds of behaviors. So I do have healthy boundaries, and those boundaries, are there to, teach you, I model those boundaries for you so you can see what they look like. And you can see what the communication looks like. And I don't pull any punches. In that, and what that means is I don't, allow people to kind of stay stuck in there. If you want to stay stuck, like, I don't want your, your investment, like I'm not into that. I do what I do, not for money. I do it because I love to help people and I love the world. I want people to heal. I don't want people to have ever experienced what I experienced in life, and especially not children. I'm very fiercely protective over children for sure. Let's see. If you want to start the process, when you get emails and stuff, you'll have an opportunity. You can book a 15-minute complimentary consult or a 60-minute if you want, and that includes 2 office visits. There's no obligation, of course. This is a free webinar. I will send you, the recording of the webinar. I'm going to shut the webinar off now. If anybody wants to ask me questions off the what do you call it, the recording, but I will definitely send this out afterwards. Just give me a couple days because we have to go through editing or whatever, and then they set up a whole campaign or whatever. So anyway, thank you guys so much for attending this webinar. I really